Fantastic. Sounded very good. Y'all, this is a wonderful Lord's Day. A little chilly. We have a special speaker today. Took a lot of litigation, of course, to get Dan to be able to speak again, being a nurse practitioner in psychiatry. Dan, if you will, here, turn this on and use this mic. Okay, come on up here, matter of fact. Okay. Dan Harris, born Memphis, Tennessee. How many people actually are from Tennessee? How many people know somebody from Tennessee? How many people know somebody from Tennessee? Okay, all right. All right, Dan, University of Alabama in Huntsville, and UAB, psychiatric nursing, nurse practitioner in psychiatry. His wife, the lovely, the charming, the intelligent, the saintly, Janice Carol Martin, changed her name to Janice Carol Martin Harris. She goes by Jan, and she's not here this morning. Usually the wives, it's kind of 50-50 whether they come and listen to the husbands or not.
She's working.
She's working, okay, all right. Dan has worked several places. Head nurse in psychiatry at Huntsville Hospital, 1989 in Birmingham. The last 8 years he's worked for Grayson and Associates. Better known for the blog, the very popular blog, Better Things for Better Living Through Chemicals. Please help me welcome Dan Harris. Come on, Dan.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, put it up just a little higher.
A little higher, okay. Can you hear me now? I feel like that monkey that goes around saying, "Can you hear me now?" I remember that commercial. Now? Pretty good? I don't know where he got that picture, off Facebook, I guess. I'm the one with glasses. The other one is the dog. This lesson sort of fits in with a little bit of what Brett was talking about, maybe. I was raised in the church, and back in the 50s and 60s, and my mother was raised in the church, and she used to, her grandparents used to keep N.B. Hardeman at their house when he was on one of his gospel meeting tours through West Tennessee where they lived. So she's been around. I've heard about it. I was sort of an old-timey Church of Christ kind of guy. And through the years, every now and then I would see something that made me think maybe there's more to church than I've thought of in the past. Or maybe there was more to church always, or things that I didn't hear about that could have been enlightening. For instance, having been raised in the church, I kind of had the idea that was the place to be, the Church of Christ. That was it. And maybe there was places for other people, but probably not. But then sometimes I would hear these little things that kind of didn't go along with that, even in churches of Christ. One of them was, I don't know if probably no one here is old enough, but there was a series of gospel meetings in Nashville. This would have been in the 1920s. It was called the Tabernacle Sermons. And it was actually at the Ryman Auditorium, the place we called Grand Ole Opry now. And N.B. Hardeman was preaching. And the reason it came to be so well known in Nashville is that his gospel meeting that was scheduled for like 3 weeks went on for 6 months. Can you believe that? It was incredible. And the house was always full. Of course, this was before TV. But people were just thrilled to death with him. And they would have gospel sermons pretty much like we all have had if we've grown up in the church. And they'd baptized a lot of people, and they sang songs. And they had the best song leader in the city, and a lot of people, they said, just came for the singing. And the song leader was a well-known song leader who sang for the largest Baptist church in town. I never knew that till many, many years later. And I'm thinking, why would N.B. Hardeman have a Baptist leading singing for him? That's not right. I don't know why. I never asked him. I don't know that he ever addressed it. But that was one of the reasons people went to see these tabernacle sermons for 6 months. And it just opened my mind to some things that I thought, there's things about all of this rules and doctrine and religion and that I don't quite understand yet, and maybe need to think about some more. In my work, I hear people talk about what things that are bothering them, things that are going on with them. And after I've been doing this for several years, I thought, why do I do this kind of work? And people would say to me, you hear people telling their troubles all day long. Why do you even enjoy this? Why do you listen to this? It occurred to me that I like stories. And basically that's what people do when they come to me, is they're telling me their story. And many times their stories have some low spots and some unhappy spots. But they have good spots too, and sometimes I can help them a little bit with some of the low spots. But I like stories. I've always liked stories. I'm a child of the 50s and 60s. Television was new. Us baby boomers, we loved TV. I still love TV. I like stories. So, it makes me think about stories sometimes in a little bit of a different way. I had a lady in my office just this past week. She was doing quite well, but she was worried about her grandchildren. And they were having some problems, fairly serious problems, but she was saying, but you know, they've just got to decide what's right on their own. I can't make them do right. She says if they would only do what I would tell them to do. And I thought, that sounds familiar. I said, I think that's what God said to the children of Abraham for 4,000 years. If they would only do what I would tell them to do, everything would be okay. And God tells the same thing to all of us. In Hosea, one of the minor prophets, he came along before the captivity of Babylon. You may recall that God told Hosea to marry this particular woman named Gomer, not Gomer Pyle, somebody else. The thing that made this command from God, or so unusual, was that Gomer was not a really pleasant person. Now, she must have been beautiful. She must have had very attractive ways about her, but she was a harlot, and that was her way of making a living. And somehow or another, Hosea had fallen in love with her. My guess would be that he'd fallen in love with her by going to meet her as she was plying her trade. Imagine what kind of conversations this would have engendered in his home or among his people. And they would all tell him, please don't have any more to do with Gomer. This is such a mistake. Please don't do this. But he asked God, well, what did God say? He said, go marry her. Go ahead, go marry her. Take her to your wife. Look after her. Love her all you can. And it didn't take much convincing for him to do just that. But God had a kind of a plan in mind when he said that. Because even when she was married to Hosea, she just could not get her old ways out of her heart. And she made some terrible mistakes. And each time she did, Hosea would go to God, oh, what can I do? What can I do? She's left me. I love her so much. God would say, you go down and you find her. Go to the worst parts of the city. Go where the foolish and unwise and evil people go and live and do their thing. And you bring her back. And he would do that. He would bring her back, and he would love her the best that he could and treat her right, and he had children with her. And before too long, she would go back down to that old part of the city again. And it was terrible. It was just terrible. And God said, you've got to understand, this is how it is with me and Israel. I love them. I do everything I can for Israel. Now, by Israel, he meant the northern kingdom. You know, the kingdom of Israel got divided a few generations after David to the northern kingdom called Israel, the southern kingdom called Judah. In the northern kingdom, they worshiped Baal. They made a new temple. So God was saying, look, you've got to understand, this is how it is with Israel and me. They've gone off, they've worshiped other gods. They don't pay attention to me. I bring them back, and they'll come back for a little while, but then they go away again. And it's miserable. You think it's miserable for you, for Hosea to leave you. It's miserable for me when my people leave me. In spite of all this, God says there's coming a time when Israel is going to turn to me. And it would be a good while. It would not be until after the Babylonian captivity. But it happened, and Hosea, because of his knowledge of how it felt to be betrayed by his wife that he loved greatly, who didn't deserve his love at all. She did not deserve it. We would say, we could find all kind of names for her that are low class. She did not deserve his love. Nevertheless, he loved her. And that's exactly the way it is with us and God, even today. Even today. And it makes you think, or makes me think, what do I do? What can I do to have God love me? Especially if I've done all these bad things, like Hosea's wife Gomer. What should I do? And that was really never addressed exactly, because there's nothing we can do. Because as bad as we are, as bad as Hosea's wife Gomer was, Hosea loved Gomer. He just loved her to pieces. It broke his heart every time she was unfaithful. It tore him up inside. But he loved her, and that's all there was to it, and he wasn't going to give up on her. I have people come talk to me sometimes about themselves or people in their family that make mistakes. And they tell me, I've just given up on them. They've gone back to using drugs. They've gone back to someone that's bad for them. They've gone back to some criminal activity. And I've just had to cut them off. And I can certainly understand that. You can't have someone like that to be an active part of your life and home without bad things happening to you. But they'll even take it a step further, and sometimes they'll say, they're not my son. They're not my daughter. They're not my brother. And even though God would cut off the people of Israel, as he did with the Babylonian captivity, he cut them off from the land they lived in, the land they loved. He never said, you're not my people. I think people sometimes will say, this person has brought so much hurt to our family, they're not my son anymore. They're none of me. You know, the reason they say that is because if they're not my son, then I don't care. If they're not my son, then I don't love them. If they're not my daughter, then I don't have to worry about them. If they're not my wife, then so what? There's no reason for me to be upset about it. They're none of mine anymore. They're none of me. In spite of the way Israel acted, in spite of the way Gomer acted, and even though they were punished, God never said, you're not mine. You're not part of me. I never knew you. And that's the way he is with us today as well. In Micah 6:8, the Micah, he was a prophet of the minor prophets, we call them. He says, what does God require of you, O man, but to do justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God? You know, there were a lot of commandments in the Old Testament, but they could all be summed up in just a few words. Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. In Matthew chapter 22, verse 37, they were asking Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? He says, the greatest commandment is this, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. And the second is like unto it, to love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. What God requires of us is not complicated. And what God requires of us, to the degree that we obey it, does not make us worthy of him. And that's something we sometimes miss. I've lived this way, I've done these good things, I've done what God said do here, so therefore God's going to take me. No. We're like Gomer. We're just unworthy. We are just unworthy. There's nothing we can do to make ourselves worthy. We've been a disappointment. But he loves us anyway. And the cure, now we know, as we've been saying a while ago, is the blood of Christ. That's the cure. That's the thing that allows us to approach God and allows us to say that we are his people. One of the people in the Bible that God loved the most, we know from Hebrews, was David, the man whom God loved. David, as we know, had many, many sins. One of the ones we know of best was his adultery with Bathsheba, and then actually murdering her husband. It was a terrible thing. But later in his life, David would write Psalms 119. As you may recall, Psalms 119 is one of the longest psalms in the book, over 100 verses. And one of the things that makes it unique is that David is talking about all the blessings which God has given us, but he talks about them in a certain kind of way. In the beginning of Psalms 119, he says, "Blessed are the undefiled in the way who walk in the law of the Lord. Blessed are they that keep his testimonies. Blessed are they that seek him with a whole heart. They also do iniquity. They walk in his ways." And he goes on for about 8 verses. And then there's another little section. And he says, "Wherewith shall a young man cleanse his way? By taking heed unto the word of God." Unto the word of God. Each of these sections of Psalms 119 is preceded by a little title. The first one is Aleph. And the second title for verses 9 through 12 is Beth. The third title is Gamil. And as you may know, Aleph, Beth, and Gamil are the beginning of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, Beth. Sounds kind of like alphabet. Well, that's exactly what it is. What David's doing is he's taking the first letter of the alphabet and making a love poem to God. Then he takes Beth, the second letter. Then he takes Gamil. Then he takes Daleth, A, B, C, D, Daleth. He makes another love poem. Then he takes Thou, a little bit different than our E. But he's taking every letter of the alphabet and he's making a love poem to God. And in spite of all the horrible things that he's done, he's saying, "This is why I love you, Lord. This is why I appreciate you." And for other people that would read it, these are some things that you can do to show your appreciation of God. And he uses the whole alphabet, all the way through to the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and writes a verse, a song, a psalm, using each of those letters. And this is the man that committed adultery and murdered the woman's husband. He, in his terrible sin that he had committed, he still found the way back to God. And it was not by doing something to prove he was acceptable. It was simply by loving God back in return. Just loving God back in return. And I'm going to compare this to a modern day story, and then I'll be through. I enjoy music. I like some jazz music. There was a saxophone player many years ago, back in the 50s and 60s. He was quite a good saxophone player. He loved women. He loved drugs. He loved everything the money bought him. And he went down the road in a way pretty much like David did, just abusing everything he could abuse and treating everyone bad that he could imagine, until finally his health was gone and he was about to die. Some friends found him lying on the floor. He couldn't stand up. And as he was being treated, he said he had this thought, "Oh God, what have I done?" He was widely thought of to be one of the finest musicians in existence. Oh God, what have I done? What have I done? And there was nothing that he could do. His health was gone. Well, the doctors did what they could. They cleaned him up. He got better. He was never the same. He was never as healthy. But he appreciated what God had done for him so much that he thought, what can I do? And so he wrote a song, and it was a jazz song. You probably wouldn't recognize it if you heard it. And he tried to talk to people about, this is a realization that I had when I nearly died, that there is a God, and we've got to do better. We've got to do better. I've got to do better. We've got to do better as a people. Of course, they made fun of him. Didn't believe it. Oh, he's nearly died. You know, he's got religion now. But he wrote this song, and it was different than any song he'd ever done. In fact, it was different than any song anybody had ever done that they knew of. And in a little while, every jazz musician knew that song. Some of them couldn't play it. And, you know, jazz is one of those types of music where you hear something, you jump in, you play your version of it. You know, a bunch of people play together even though they don't know the notes. They play together and it sounds good. It was hard to do for this song that he wrote. His song was called, he called it A Love Supreme. And what made it different was that, as you know, if you took piano when you were little or were in the band, one of the first things you do on an instrument is you learn to play the scale. You know, if you play the trumpet, you play the B-flat scale. If you play the flute, you play the C scale. If you play the saxophone, you might play the E-flat scale. And we even learn the scales. There's 12 major scales. You learn the 12 major scales. You learn the 12 minor scales. But that's not all the scales. There's dozens and dozens of scales. There's all kinds of scales. But even in jazz, most people stuck to the major scales and the major minor scales. What he did in The Love Supreme was he used over 60 different scales. That is 60 different tones, 60 different tunings. And in each tuning, he was saying, this is how I love you, God. This is how I love you. This is what you've done for me. This is how much I appreciate you. And it's a little bit like what David was saying with his Psalms 119, going through every letter of the alphabet. I don't know if Charlie knew much about writing, but he knew music. And he wrote a love song, a love verse to God in every scale that he could, and nobody else could play it because they didn't know what scale he was jumping to next. Only he could play it. And it's often thought of as being one of the greatest jazz suites ever written. A Love Supreme. And although a lot of jazz music is entirely instrumental, he did sing some words himself in this song, and the words were A Love Supreme. He wanted everyone to know, this is what God has done for me. I don't know in the spiritual realm, in the religious realm, exactly how everything works out. But I know that this man was down to the point of death, and he got better, and he gave and did everything he could for God. And that's a great thing, I think. God doesn't need us to do some great thing for him. He just wants us to love him. And he just wants us, like Michael said, Micah, to do the right thing. Love mercy. Be kind. Be just. Just do the right thing. Everything else is extra. And as Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor, everything hangs on this. That's what David found out. I believe that's what Charlie Parker found out when he was nearly dead and wound up writing this. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Dan, fantastic. So it's Charlie Parker. Wow.